Sirens began echoing across several American military facilities late last night after reports surfaced that a controversial deployment order tied to ground troops had quietly moved forward behind closed doors. According to multiple political insiders and defense analysts, the decision, linked to former U.S. President Donald Trump, may trigger one of the most dramatic geopolitical confrontations the global energy market has faced in years. What initially appeared to be a routine military planning move quickly turned into something far more explosive, because the alleged deployment was not just about reinforcing troops. It was about positioning American ground forces near some of the most strategically sensitive oil corridors on Earth. And that is where the situation begins to escalate rapidly. Reports indicate that discussions surrounding the deployment involved contingency plans for securing critical energy infrastructure stretching across parts of the Gulf and surrounding maritime routes. These routes are not just regional shipping lanes. They are the arteries through which a massive portion of the world's oil supply flows every single day. Any disruption there would ripple instantly through global energy markets. And that is exactly why analysts are suddenly warning about a scenario few people expected to return so quickly, one where oil prices surge toward the psychologically critical threshold of $100 per barrel. But before we break down how this political scandal surrounding troop deployments could potentially shake global markets, make sure you hit the like button and subscribe to the channel so you never miss the latest geopolitical developments shaping the world. According to early reports circulating among defense correspondents, the controversy began when internal discussions about expanding U.S. military presence near key energy transit zones were leaked to several media outlets. The proposal allegedly included preparing ground forces for rapid deployment in case tensions surrounding regional shipping routes escalated further. To understand why this has sparked such intense debate, it is important to look at the geography involved. The Middle East remains one of the most strategically sensitive energy regions on the planet. Oil tankers carrying millions of barrels of crude travel through narrow maritime choke points every day before heading toward major consumer markets in Europe and Asia. Even small disruptions along these routes can create immediate panic in financial markets. Energy traders closely watch every political signal coming from Washington, Tehran, and regional capitals, because those signals often determine how secure these supply lines appear. And in the world of commodities trading, perception can move prices almost as quickly as actual conflict. That is why the reports involving potential ground troop deployment are raising eyebrows across the global energy industry. If military forces were positioned near these corridors, it could signal preparations for a much broader confrontation scenario. Some analysts believe the move could be intended as a deterrent message aimed at rival regional powers. Others argue it could increase tensions rather than reduce them. But what happened next caught the attention of market observers even more. Within hours of the reports emerging, oil futures began reacting to the possibility of instability surrounding critical shipping lanes. Energy markets are extremely sensitive to geopolitical risk. When traders believe supply routes might be threatened, prices can jump almost immediately. That reaction reflects how tightly the global economy is tied to steady energy flows. Industries ranging from aviation to manufacturing depend heavily on predictable oil prices. Even modest increases can ripple through transportation costs, consumer prices, and national inflation rates. And that is where the broader consequences begin to emerge. Countries across Europe and Asia rely heavily on imported energy supplies moving through the Gulf region. If tensions surrounding troop deployments were to escalate into a larger confrontation, the effects could extend far beyond military calculations. Shipping insurers could raise risk premiums. Freight companies might reroute vessels, and energy importers could begin competing aggressively for alternative supplies. Each of those reactions pushes oil markets further toward volatility. Meanwhile, military analysts are closely watching how regional defense forces respond to the reports. Naval patrols in nearby waters have reportedly increased in recent days, suggesting that multiple governments are preparing for the possibility of sudden escalation. Surveillance aircraft and reconnaissance drones have also been observed conducting expanded monitoring operations across several strategic zones. Such movements often signal that military planners are preparing for multiple scenarios simultaneously. But the strategic message behind the alleged deployment remains the biggest question of all. Was it meant to deter rival powers from threatening shipping routes? Or was it intended as preparation for a much larger geopolitical confrontation that could reshape the energy balance of the entire region? Because if the situation continues escalating the way some analysts fear, oil markets could face their most dramatic shock since the early stages of the 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine. And if that happens, the push toward $100 oil may only be the beginning. Energy markets are now watching every signal coming from Washington and regional capitals. Military observers are analyzing satellite imagery and troop movements, and political analysts are debating what this controversial deployment decision truly means for the future of the region. But one critical question still remains unanswered. If tensions continue rising, could this ground troop scandal become the spark that pushes global oil markets into their next major crisis? What makes the situation even more complicated is how quickly military positioning can change the psychology of global markets. Energy traders are not just watching political headlines anymore. They are now monitoring troop movements, satellite imagery, and naval patrol patterns to determine whether this controversy could turn into something far more serious. Because when ground troops begin appearing near strategic energy corridors, it sends a signal that governments may be preparing for scenarios beyond diplomacy. And that is precisely why the debate surrounding the reported deployment tied to Donald Trump has become so intense in Washington. Several defense analysts argue that positioning forces near sensitive oil routes could be interpreted by rival powers as a direct escalation. Others believe the strategy may be designed to reassure allies who depend heavily on secure energy shipments. But what happened next began drawing attention far beyond political circles. Shipping companies operating in the Gulf quietly started reviewing contingency plans. These plans include rerouting tankers, adjusting insurance coverage, and preparing for the possibility that certain transit zones could suddenly become high-risk areas. Such adjustments might sound technical, but they can have massive economic consequences. Every additional security precaution increases the cost of transporting oil. And those costs inevitably make their way into the price consumers pay for energy. In other words, a military decision thousands of miles away can eventually influence fuel prices at gas stations around the world. And that is where the stakes begin expanding far beyond the battlefield. Major economies across Europe, East Asia, and South Asia rely heavily on stable oil flows from the Gulf region. Factories, shipping networks, airlines, and power grids all depend on predictable energy costs. If markets begin fearing a prolonged confrontation around those routes, companies may start stockpiling energy supplies. Governments could also begin tapping into strategic petroleum reserves as a precaution, but even those emergency reserves have limits. They are designed to cushion short-term shocks, not prolonged geopolitical crises. Meanwhile, military activity in the region appears to be gradually increasing. Defense monitoring groups have reported expanded surveillance flights and additional naval patrols across several strategic maritime zones. These movements are often precautionary, but they can also signal that commanders are preparing for rapid escalation if tensions worsen. And that is why analysts are focusing so closely on the message behind the alleged troop deployment. Military strategy is rarely just about immediate operations. It is also about signaling intent to both allies and adversaries. Deploying ground forces near critical infrastructure can serve as a warning that certain assets will be defended at all costs. But it can also create the perception that confrontation is becoming more likely. That perception alone can move markets dramatically. Financial institutions and hedge funds often react to geopolitical risk long before events actually unfold. Once uncertainty enters the equation, traders begin pricing in worst-case scenarios. And in the oil market, worst-case scenarios often involve supply disruptions. Even a temporary disruption involving a few key shipping lanes could remove millions of barrels per day from global circulation. When supply tightens while demand remains steady, prices tend to climb rapidly. Some analysts believe that if tensions surrounding this controversy continue escalating, oil could approach the $100 mark far sooner than many economists expected. But there is another dimension to the story that makes the situation even more unpredictable. Political divisions inside the United States are already shaping how the deployment reports are being interpreted. Supporters argue that strengthening military positioning protects global trade routes and deters aggression. Critics warn that such moves risk dragging the country into another prolonged conflict in an already volatile region. And that political divide only adds another layer of uncertainty for global observers trying to understand what happens next. Because geopolitical crises rarely follow a predictable timeline. They evolve through reactions and counter-reactions. One military maneuver leads to another. One political statement triggers a new round of warnings. And suddenly, a localized controversy becomes a global flashpoint. Right now, the world is still trying to determine which path this situation will follow. Military forces remain alert, energy markets remain cautious, and analysts continue examining every signal coming from Washington and regional capitals. But the most important question is still hanging in the air. If this ground troop scandal continues to unfold the way some experts fear, could it ignite the chain reaction that pushes oil prices past 100 and pulls the world into its next major geopolitical energy crisis?